The chill of November had settled over New York, a damp wind curling between skyscrapers, carrying the scent of wet asphalt. Benjamin Hard's phone buzzed on his desk, cutting through the muted strains of Chopin. He read the message, Skyline Tower. Campbell. Immediate. Within minutes, Hard was on the streets, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen enough shadows to navigate them. The Skyline Tower rose before him, glass and steel piercing the gray sky. Inside, the lobby was pristine, almost antiseptic, yet the air held a tension, a tremor of something gone terribly wrong. The elevator ride to the 72nd floor was silent except for the soft hum of cables. Hard catalogued every detail, polished buttons, faint scuff marks, the flicker of fluorescent lights. Small details carried weight. When the doors opened, he felt the subtle difference immediately. The penthouse air was too clean, too controlled, as though the outside world had been barred. Stepping in, the first thing he noticed was the eerie perfection. The floor gleamed, reflecting dim light from panoramic windows. Every piece of furniture was in place, the bed made with geometric precision. No cup on the counter, no scattered papers, everything designed to impress, or to deceive. At the center lay Harold Campbell. He appeared disturbingly serene, sprawled on the rug, a faint almond scent lingering in the air, a bitter, subtle trace. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle. Death had left a puzzle. Hard began his methodical sweep. The anomalies were immediate, CCTV monitors displayed only static. The blackout lasted 12 minutes, a narrow window for careful action. The penthouse door was locked from inside, brass mechanism clicking with certainty. No forced entry, no tampering. Whoever had been here had intimate knowledge of the space. His eyes moved to subtle details others would miss, a small puddle on the polished floor, angled as if someone stepped in from outside. Tiny scuffs along the rug's edge hinted at movement, precise but deliberate. Even the air seemed to carry stories, faint citrus polish, dusty corners, light reflections. Each fragment was a clue, a whisper of someone's passage. Hard moved systematically, touching nothing, cataloging everything. He mentally sketched possibilities, 3 primary suspects, each with motive and means. Sophie Campbell, the young wife, poised but evasive. Julian Marks, polished partner, concealing resentment. Victor, the concierge, quiet, intimate with the building, often unnoticed. Hard sat on the sofa, replaying events. 12 minutes. The storm outside pelted the glass. The puddle suggested ingress, yet balcony doors were locked. Nothing accidental. The orchestrator remained invisible, hidden behind deception and routine. He walked to the kitchen, noting absence of ordinary life, no mugs, no papers. Every detail deliberate, every absence meaningful. Hard's mind traced pathways, connecting dots, dismissing irrelevance, highlighting vital traces. Outside, wind rattled panes. Inside, Hard catalogued minutiae, constructing a map of the events leading to Campbell's death. No proof yet, no confessions, no clarity, but he had a starting point. The clock ticked audibly. 12 minutes. Every second mattered. And Benjamin Hard, as always, would notice what everyone else missed. Benjamin Hard moved deliberately through the penthouse, his eyes scanning every surface with the precision of a man who had trained himself to see what others ignored. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, rain rattling against the panoramic windows, masking the distant sounds of the city below. The penthouse felt suspended in time, frozen in a moment that only Hard seemed capable of reading. He began with the living area, noting the subtle displacement of items that an untrained eye would dismiss. A chair slightly angled, a faint indentation on the rug, and the soft gleam of the hardwood floor revealed patterns of movement. Hard crouched to inspect the puddle near the balcony doors. The water had trickled inward from somewhere above, leaving traces that suggested the presence of a visitor who had come and gone with deliberate care. The rain had created a faint echo of movement, yet the door's lock showed no signs of tampering. Whoever had entered had been careful, precise, and calculated. The pocket watch in Harold Campbell's jacket caught Hard's attention next. Its hands were frozen at 1912, the exact moment the CCTV had failed. It was an oddity, but Hard's analytical mind considered every detail. The watch was not just a timepiece, it was a clue embedded in the crime scene. Why had it stopped at that precise moment? Was it accidental, or was it a signal left by someone who understood Campbell's habits intimately? Hard noted it carefully, committing its position and orientation to memory. He moved systematically, room by room. The kitchen, pristine and devoid of any personal clutter, offered no immediate explanation for Campbell's final hours. There were no cups, no scattered papers, no sign of a hurried breakfast or last-minute snack. Even the faint smell of lemon-scented polish lingered, blending with the subtle almond scent already noted in the living area. Every sensory cue added to the mental image Hard was constructing, and yet he knew the true story lay beneath the surface, invisible to casual observation. In the study, shelves of books stood in perfect order, spines aligned meticulously. Hard ran his fingers over the leather bindings, feeling the subtle variations in texture. Some books were recently disturbed, the top corners bore the faintest traces of fingerprints. These minor irregularities told him that someone had searched, intentionally or not, for information. He catalogued these observations, mentally mapping the flow of movement throughout the apartment. Hard paused by the balcony windows, tracing the condensation patterns along the glass. Rain had dripped in certain areas, forming rivulets that indicated someone's path. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it spoke volumes to a trained observer. He considered the timing, the sequence of events, the manner in which the suspect must have moved, and the careful orchestration required to leave so little evidence behind. Returning to the living room, Hard noted the faint scuff marks on the edges of the rug near Campbell's body. They were subtle, a barely visible trail of movement that suggested an unhurried but deliberate placement. There was a rhythm to the chaos, a pattern that could be traced, understood, and eventually reconstructed. Hard's mind worked tirelessly, assembling pieces of a puzzle that seemed almost invisible to the world. By the time he had completed his first sweep, Hard had mentally sketched the general outline of what had transpired. The anomaly of the 12-minute CCTV blackout, the frozen watch, the subtle puddle, the displaced furniture, the disturbed books, all hinted at a careful, meticulous hand. One that moved with precision, patience, and intimate knowledge of the space. Hard leaned against the wall, allowing the storm outside to wash over his thoughts. Each observation reinforced his certainty: this was no ordinary crime of passion or opportunistic violence. It had been executed with intelligence, with patience, with an understanding of both human behavior and environmental control. The question now was simple: who had orchestrated this near-perfect illusion, and why? For Benjamin Hard, there was no panic, no rush, only the meticulous reconstruction of events, the quiet unraveling of hidden truths. The city outside roared on, indifferent to death and deception. Inside, he began to see the first outlines of the puzzle, a picture no one else had yet glimpsed. Every small detail mattered, and he intended to notice them all. Benjamin Hard spent the next hour reviewing the details in his mind while walking the penthouse once more. The storm outside had softened to a steady drizzle, the streets below slick and reflective, mirroring the city lights like a fractured painting. He knew the next step: meet the people closest to Harold Campbell. Motive, opportunity, and subtle tells, these were the threads he needed to follow. The first was Sophie Campbell, the young wife. She waited in the spacious sitting room, her posture immaculate, hands folded lightly in her lap. Her eyes betrayed a practiced calm, but Hard noticed the subtle twitch of her left eyebrow, the faint tightening around her mouth. He introduced himself with his usual courtesy, observing her reactions more than listening to her words at first. "Mr. Hard, I can't believe this happened," she said, voice measured. "I understand," Hard replied evenly. "I need to ask a few questions about last night." As she recounted her movements, Hard noted contradictions. She claimed to have been at a charity dinner until 7:30, yet a faint lipstick stain on her sleeve suggested she had returned to the apartment earlier. A silver bracelet shifted slightly as she gestured, revealing subtle tension in her fingers. Every micro-expression, every hesitant pause, painted a picture. She was hiding something, though perhaps not the whole truth. Next, Julian Marks arrived. He was a tall, composed man with an easy smile that did little to hide the simmering frustration beneath. Hard watched him carefully as he shook hands, noting the slight stiffness in the shoulder, the way his eyes darted briefly to the windows before returning to Hard's gaze. "I lost a lot of money because of Harold," Julian said bluntly, almost proud. "But murder? That's not me." Hard filed the statement away, but he noticed the twitch at Julian's jawline and the faint discoloration on his cuff where a coffee spill had dried. Small, inconsequential details, perhaps, but Hard knew better. Stress, anger, and resentment always left traces, no matter how polished the exterior. Finally, Victor, the concierge, entered. Quiet, efficient, and unobtrusive, he moved like a shadow through the room. Hard's trained eyes noticed the dampness on his shoes, the faint mud that had been brushed off in a hurried, careless manner. Victor's gaze met Hard's briefly, lingering just long enough to measure the man in front of him. "You know this building better than anyone," Hard said gently. "Did you notice anything unusual last night?" Victor shook his head. "Nothing out of the ordinary, sir." But Hard had already catalogued his movements, the slight scuff on the stairwell, the alignment of the lobby mats, the irregularity of the elevator timing. Opportunity existed. Means were plausible. And yet, no confession, no guilt. Only subtle indicators, pieces of the human puzzle waiting to be assembled. Hard sat in the corner of the sitting room, silently reviewing each suspect. Sophie's carefully constructed calm, Julian's barely concealed anger, Victor's unremarkable exterior, they all had motives, means, and the capacity to hide intentions. The storm outside mirrored the chaos of human behavior, unpredictable and ever-shifting. He leaned back, allowing himself a brief pause. Observing these people was like reading a complex manuscript, each gesture a sentence, each glance a paragraph. Hard knew the smallest inconsistencies would become the most important details. In the coming hours, he would trace their movements, scrutinize their interactions, and compare them against the evidence scattered throughout the penthouse. For now, he observed silently. The suspects were aware of him, but unaware of how precisely he could read them. Every twitch, every hesitation, every glance, it all mattered. And Hard, as always, was watching. The storm outside continued its rhythmic patter against the windows. Inside, 3 individuals sat in apparent calm, each hiding layers that Hard intended to unravel. Every lie, every omission, every subtle tell was a piece of the puzzle. And Benjamin Hard would notice them all. Benjamin Hard returned to his temporary observation post in the penthouse, a high-backed chair near the window that offered a clear view of both the living space and the storm-drenched skyline beyond. Rain continued to fall in relentless sheets, the occasional gust rattling the window panes. The city below seemed alive, indifferent to death and deception, while Hard's focus remained entirely on the puzzle in front of him. He began tracing the patterns of Harold Campbell's final hours. The frozen watch at 1912, the 12-minute CCTV blackout, the puddle by the balcony, all pieces of a timeline he was slowly constructing in his mind. Hard's methodology was simple in theory, complex in execution: establish the who, the where, the when, and then layer the why on top. The why was always the trickiest. Motive was rarely obvious, often hidden behind smiles, pleasantries, and polished appearances. Sophie Campbell remained at the forefront of his analysis. Her rehearsed calm suggested a woman accustomed to observation and social maneuvering. Hard considered the discrepancies in her statements, her reported dinner timeline, the lipstick on her sleeve, the minor tension in her gestures. None of these alone proved guilt, but patterns began to emerge. Sophie's life was entwined with money, status, and inheritance. She had everything to gain, or perhaps to protect. Next, Julian Marks. Hard reviewed the partner's statements, financial records, and professional correspondence. Julian's losses were substantial, his anger well documented. He had motive in a conventional sense: revenge for professional humiliation, compensation for monetary damage. Yet Hard also noted the subtle behaviors, how Julian's gaze flicked to the windows when uncomfortable, the faint coffee stains on his cuffs, the tension in his jaw. Motive alone did not make him a killer, but it painted a backdrop of simmering hostility that could be exploited. Victor, the concierge, was the most enigmatic. Unassuming and precise, he blended into the background, yet Hard's attention to detail revealed minor irregularities. Damp shoes, hurriedly wiped mud, the timing of elevator usage, all suggested he could have moved through the building unnoticed. He had access, opportunity, and the calm of someone trained to observe without being observed. Opportunity alone, however, was never enough for Hard to make a conclusion. Hard then turned his attention to environmental factors. The rain, the puddle, the wind patterns, each could be a tool or a distraction. The storm could cover tracks, mask entry and exit, create plausible deniability. Hard calculated movement routes, timings, and potential interactions, mentally replaying the 12-minute window over and over. Each possibility had to align with behavior, motive, and opportunity. He considered the psychological patterns as well. Campbell, for all his meticulousness, had routines: evening aromatherapy, review of financial documents, a nightly walk to the balcony. A killer with knowledge of these habits could exploit them, controlling the sequence of events without leaving obvious traces. Hard's mind sketched multiple profiles, layering motives with behavioral patterns and logistical constraints. The penthouse itself revealed subtle contradictions. Dust displaced in certain areas, minor scuffs on the rug, slight shifts in furniture alignment, all suggested movement, deliberate but careful. Hard catalogued these, comparing them with the suspect's known behaviors. Each tiny detail hinted at an invisible choreography, executed by someone aware of both the environment and human psychology. By the end of the evening, Hard had constructed 3 plausible scenarios, each implicating one of the primary suspects. Sophie for calculated gain, Julian for emotional revenge, Victor for access and opportunity. Yet he knew the most dangerous element often lay hidden, the person no one noticed, the shadow in plain sight. Hard did not discount that possibility. He had learned, through years of observation, that the least conspicuous figure was often the one capable of orchestrating chaos without detection. Leaning back in his chair, Hard allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. The storm outside had not abated, the city moved on without awareness of the death that had occurred above it. Inside, patterns and motives swirled in Hard's mind, each hypothesis a thread waiting to be traced. Every detail mattered, every gesture, every scuff, every pause. And Benjamin Hard, as always, would notice them all. The storm outside had softened to a steady drizzle, its rhythmic patter against the windows echoing throughout the penthouse. Benjamin Hard moved with methodical precision, retracing paths he had already walked, scanning for details that might have escaped his initial scrutiny. The apartment remained pristine, almost sterile, yet every surface seemed to whisper the story of someone who had moved through with intent. Hard crouched near the living room rug again, observing tiny scuff marks along the edges. They were subtle, nearly invisible, but their placement suggested deliberate movement rather than accidental passage. He noted the direction, the pressure, the slight smudge of dirt carried in from outside. Each anomaly added a layer to the mental map he was constructing. In the kitchen, Hard's gaze lingered on the faint streaks of polish along the countertops, the slight shift in the spice rack, and the absence of what would normally indicate human activity: no coffee mug, no crumbs, no sign of a casual breakfast. It was the precision of absence that intrigued him most. Someone had moved through this space with care, leaving it as untouched as if to erase their passage entirely. Hard's attention was drawn to the cleaning supplies cabinet near the service entrance. He paused, noting the alignment of bottles, the subtle residue on the shelf edges. Small fingerprints marked the edges, almost imperceptible, yet they suggested routine use by someone who knew the apartment intimately. Hard catalogued these in his mind, weighing their relevance. It was then that Maria, the maid, entered the room quietly. She was a small, unassuming figure, her movements efficient and almost automatic. She did not speak immediately, merely offered a polite nod and continued her tasks with the precision of someone well practiced. Hard's eyes followed her subtly, noting the lack of tension, the absence of self-conscious gestures, the ease with which she navigated the apartment. Her presence was easy to overlook, exactly the type of person one might forget to question. Hard's mind registered this, filing the observation under potentially significant. She had access, of course, to every room, every corner, every routine pattern. Yet her calm, almost invisible demeanor created an aura of irrelevance. She moved like a shadow, silent and precise. Hard returned to the study, reviewing the arrangement of books. Certain volumes appeared recently disturbed, top corners showing faint fingerprints. The sequence suggested a targeted search rather than random browsing. Hard noted the implications: someone had been looking for something, and they had known exactly where to find it. The movements were deliberate, controlled, and almost ritualistic. In the living area, Hard studied the puddle near the balcony again. Its shape, angle, and the slight displacement of nearby furniture suggested careful navigation through the room. Someone had accounted for the environment, predicting each outcome, ensuring no trace would mislead an observer. He reflected on the suspects, Sophie's evasions, Julian's simmering resentment, Victor's quiet efficiency. And yet, as Hard pieced together these observations, a subtle realization emerged: the person who could move unnoticed, with intimate knowledge of the apartment, might be someone entirely unremarkable, someone whose very ordinariness masked their capability. Hard did not yet have proof, only threads. Each anomaly, the displaced dust, the faint smudges, the subtle alignment of objects, was a whisper pointing to a hidden presence. And he knew that the invisible, the overlooked, often held the most dangerous secrets. Sitting back, Hard allowed himself a moment of contemplation. The storm outside mirrored the internal chaos of human behavior, unpredictable, persistent, and layered with subtlety. Within the precise lines of the apartment, the faint trails of movement and intention were waiting to be traced. And Benjamin Hard, as always, would notice them all. The penthouse remained a cathedral of silence, broken only by the occasional drip of rain from the balcony above. Benjamin Hard moved through the rooms with deliberate patience, retracing steps, examining minute details that others would have dismissed. He had observed the primary suspects, mapped their motives, and catalogued their behaviors. Yet the most intriguing thread, the one that had begun to gnaw at the edges of his mind, was not found in the loud gestures or obvious contradictions. It was hidden in the quiet, the overlooked, the invisible. Hard returned to the living room, crouching to examine the scuff marks along the rug once more. The impressions suggested careful movement, a choreography executed with precision and intent. He noted the alignment of furniture, the slight shifts in polished surfaces, and the faint trails of water from the balcony puddle. Each anomaly told a story, but the story's author remained elusive. He turned his attention to Maria, the maid. She moved silently through the penthouse, performing her tasks with methodical efficiency. Hard observed her as if she were a piece of the puzzle itself. Her routine was flawless, almost too flawless. She entered the rooms, cleaned the surfaces, adjusted minor imperfections. Her presence was constant yet unobtrusive. No one questioned her, no one remembered her movements beyond the superficial. It was the perfect cover. Hard considered her access, every room, every hallway, every nook within the penthouse. She knew the layout intimately, understood the flow of light and the timing of the evening, and had observed the habits of Harold Campbell for months. Subtle discrepancies, the alignment of books, the arrangement of cushions, the faint traces of movement, could all have been orchestrated by her, and yet she remained invisible to everyone else. He mapped out the 12-minute window during which the CCTV had failed. Timing, access, and environmental factors all suggested an orchestrated intrusion. Rain had dripped in from the balcony, creating plausible ambiguity. The puddle on the floor, once a minor curiosity, now indicated calculated movement. Hard imagined each step taken, each pause, each adjustment. Whoever had executed the crime had anticipated every reaction, every trace left behind, and had remained undetected because they were overlooked. Hard moved systematically, cataloging interactions and correlating them with environmental data. He revisited the study, noting the subtly disturbed books, the fingerprints along the edges of shelves, and the faint dust shifts. Each detail reinforced a theory he was developing: the killer was not one of the obvious suspects, nor was the solution to be found in aggression or overt confrontation. It was subtlety, invisibility, and intimate knowledge of the space that allowed this crime to occur. He recalled past cases in which the most mundane, ordinary individuals had been the orchestrators of complex crimes. The ones who blended into the background, the quiet observers, the overlooked participants, they often had the patience and foresight to manipulate events without leaving conventional traces. This pattern repeated itself in Hard's mind as he watched Maria move through the penthouse, her presence silent, almost ceremonial. By evening, Hard had sketched an outline of possible movements and actions during the blackout, carefully matching them against what he knew of the suspect's routines. Nothing matched completely, except the subtle presence of the maid, whose uninterrupted access, familiarity with the apartment, and invisibility to others created the perfect conditions for a crime that would leave no obvious clues. Leaning against the window frame, Hard allowed himself a moment of reflection. The storm outside had softened, the city beyond continuing its indifferent pace. Inside, the traces of movement, the hints of routine, and the overlooked details formed a map of an invisible hand. And Benjamin Hard, as always, would notice it. Benjamin Hard returned to the penthouse with a renewed focus. The storm had faded into a light drizzle, and the city lights below cast a fragmented glow through the panoramic windows. Every observation, every anomaly, every subtle trace now demanded synthesis. It was time to piece together the hours that led to Harold Campbell's death, to reconstruct the invisible choreography of events, and to determine who had moved with both precision and intent. Hard began with the living room. He visualized the sequence of movement, Campbell's routine, the timing of the CCTV blackout, the puddle near the balcony, and the subtle scuff marks across the rug. The 12-minute window was narrow, yet it allowed enough time for a carefully orchestrated action. Each detail suggested forethought, yet the perpetrator had avoided leaving any obvious trail. Hard traced the path in his mind multiple times, each reconstruction revealing slight inconsistencies that others would have missed. Next, he reviewed the suspect's movements. Sophie Campbell's timeline conflicted subtly with other accounts: her claimed dinner departure, the lipstick stain on her sleeve, the tension in her gestures. Julian Mark's emotional state and documented losses provided motive, yet his physical presence did not fully align with the environment's disturbances. Victor, the concierge, had access and familiarity with the building, but his movements lacked the subtlety necessary to manipulate the apartment's details unnoticed. And then there was Maria. The quiet maid, unassuming and almost invisible, had the most consistent alignment with the anomalies. She had access to every room, intimate knowledge of the apartment's layout, and a routine that allowed her to navigate without detection. Hard catalogued each subtle movement she had made during previous observations: the alignment of cushions, the slight shifts in books, the methodical handling of surfaces. The invisible hand had been observed, and it belonged to her. Hard reconstructed the night in meticulous detail. He imagined Campbell's habits, the ritual of evening aromatherapy, the review of documents, his predictable movements from study to balcony. He mapped the timing of the storm, the flow of water from the balcony, and the puddle's formation. Then he overlaid the suspect's known behaviors and access points. Only Maria's patterns aligned perfectly. Every subtle disruption, every trace left behind, every calculated moment matched the skill and knowledge of someone who had been overlooked by everyone else. Hard sat back, reviewing the pieces he had assembled. The puzzle was no longer abstract, it was a coherent, almost mechanical sequence of human action. The invisible threads now formed a tangible image. His mind ran through contingencies, testing scenarios, probing for inconsistencies. There were none. The quiet maid, who had faded into the background, had orchestrated a complex crime with precision and foresight. Even the smallest details, once dismissed, now held significance. The angle of a scuff mark, the timing of the watch, the alignment of a cushion, each was a deliberate element in a carefully planned design. Hard's analysis revealed not only the how, but the why, a motive buried beneath years of personal grievance, masked by the invisibility of her social presence. By the end of the evening, Hard's reconstruction was complete. He had mapped the invisible hand that moved through the penthouse, linking anomalies to the quiet figure who had remained unnoticed. He knew the next step would require direct engagement, subtle questioning, and careful psychological pressure. The confession was not far off, and the invisible would soon be revealed. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the intricate dance of observation and deduction occurring above it. Inside, Benjamin Hard allowed himself a small, calculated pause. Every subtle trace mattered. Every hidden action was accounted for. And the puzzle, once scattered across rooms and objects, was now whole. The next morning, the skyline of Manhattan glimmered under a pale winter sun. Inside the penthouse, the air was still sharp with the faint scent of polish and rain. Benjamin Hard waited in the sitting room, posture relaxed but mind sharpened to a blade. Across from him, Maria stood with folded hands, her eyes lowered as if in deference. Hard began without preamble. "Maria, you were here yesterday evening." "Yes, Mr. Hard. I clean every night." Mr. Campbell liked things perfect. Her voice was soft, measured. Not a tremor. Hard noted the steadiness. "And you know every room. Every lock. Every habit of his." "I know my work," she replied, almost a whisper. Hard leaned forward. The cameras were down for 12 minutes. During that time, someone entered, or never left, the penthouse. The balcony floor shows footprints smaller than Campbell's, light but deliberate. "They match your shoe size." Maria's eyes flickered, only for an instant. A micro-gesture, but enough. Hard continued, his tone calm, clinical. "You moved quietly. You anticipated the storm, used the rain to disguise your tracks. You knew the timing of his aromatherapy machine, the way he preferred almond oil at night. Cyanide carries the same scent." She exhaled slowly, but said nothing. Hard studied her silence as one studies a rare text. "You watched him for months. Cleaning, observing, invisible to him and everyone else. You waited for the moment when the world would assume someone more obvious, a wife, a partner, a concierge. But invisibility is the perfect disguise." A long pause filled the room. Outside, a siren wailed and faded into the city's distance. Maria's shoulders lowered by a fraction. "My brother," she said finally, barely audible. "He trusted Campbell's project. Lost everything. He couldn't bear it." Her words carried no theatrics, only quiet certainty. "You planned this for years," Hard said, voice steady. "I cleaned his mess for years," she answered, eyes lifting at last. "I only returned what he gave us, emptiness." Hard stood, the conversation complete. He did not gloat, did not moralize. Justice, he knew, was often a quiet thing. He signaled to the officers waiting beyond the door. They entered silently, placing cuffs on her wrists. She offered no resistance, only the dignity of someone who had accepted the inevitable long before. As they led her away, Hard looked around the immaculate penthouse one last time. The storm had passed, yet the air felt charged, as if the building itself held its breath. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer scattered, the story had reached its inevitable end. Still, something lingered. Hard's eyes swept the room again, instinct guiding him. He sensed that the apartment, so carefully arranged, still held a final whisper, a trace of the invisible hand that had moved within these walls. But that discovery, he knew, would wait for the quiet after the noise, when the last echoes of confession faded and the true silence returned. The penthouse had fallen into a hushed stillness. Maria had been escorted away, and the officer's footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving Benjamin Hart alone with the aftermath of carefully orchestrated chaos. The rain had ceased, leaving the city below glistening with the reflections of neon lights and winter sunlight. For Hart, the real work now began, reviewing the scene, cataloging the evidence, and letting the puzzle settle into clarity. He walked slowly through the rooms, each step measured, each glance deliberate. The living area remained immaculate, the subtle scuff marks on the rug, the faint puddle, and the disturbed books forming a silent testimony of what had occurred. Hart catalogued every anomaly, comparing them to his mental reconstruction. Every detail had fallen into place, confirming his deductions. Every trace now made sense in the context of Maria's quiet, deliberate movements. He paused by the balcony, letting his gaze drift over the wet ledges, the droplets still clinging to the glass. The storm had left behind a pattern of footprints in the faint puddle, a signature of movement through the apartment. Hart considered how cleverly Maria had used the environment, the rain masking steps, the layout obscuring line of sight, the timing of Campbell's routines. Every element had been controlled, yet all of it had now been accounted for in his reconstruction. Returning to the living room, Hart's eyes swept across the polished surfaces, the precisely aligned furniture, the untouched bookshelves. And then, as his gaze settled near the sideboard, he noticed it, a small, brass key lying almost unnoticed beneath the edge of a decorative tray. Its presence had been entirely masked by the room's perfection, as if waiting to be discovered only after the truth had been revealed. Hart picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hand. The weight was solid, familiar in a way only a professional like him could appreciate. It was more than a simple tool, it was a testament to the meticulous planning, a final piece of the puzzle left behind by the person who had moved unseen. He allowed himself the faintest smile. This key would join his collection, a subtle trophy of insight, patience, and observation. It symbolized not just the crime, but the art of deduction, the discipline required to notice what everyone else overlooked. Sitting in the chair near the window, Hart reflected on the events. Justice had been delivered, yet the process had been quiet, almost imperceptible. The city outside thrummed with life, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded above. Inside, the penthouse now held only the echoes of calculated action, the residue of invisible movement, and the faint satisfaction of a puzzle completed. Benjamin Hart's thoughts lingered on the subtle artistry of the crime, the delicate balance between human emotion and meticulous planning. Maria's actions had been deliberate, patient, and exacting. She had been invisible to everyone but him, and only because he had trained himself to see the unseen. The key in his hand was more than a memento, it was proof of observation, deduction, and the quiet triumph of noticing what others did not. As he placed the key in his pocket, Hart allowed the apartment to settle around him. Each object, each trace, each subtle misalignment had spoken, revealing the hidden narrative with absolute clarity. The case was closed, the invisible revealed, and the final piece, a simple brass key, now held the story in the palm of his hand. Benjamin Hart rose, straightened his coat, and walked to the window, gazing at the city below. The storm had passed. The truth had been uncovered. And, for the first time since the call, he allowed himself a moment of calm. The penthouse was silent now, save for the soft hum of the city far below. Benjamin Hart stood near the window, the brass key resting securely in his pocket, a small, tangible reminder of a puzzle solved, of the invisible threads unraveled. The storm had passed entirely, leaving the skyline sharp and clear, the streets glistening like wet glass. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to observe the aftermath of calculated chaos from a quiet distance. Hart reflected on the course of the investigation. The suspects had been obvious, their motives visible to any casual observer, Sophie with her elegance and half-truths, Julian with his simmering resentment, Victor with his intimate access. Yet the crime had been committed by someone entirely overlooked, an ordinary, invisible figure whose life had been touched by loss and injustice. Maria's quiet efficiency and unnoticed presence had allowed her to orchestrate a meticulous, seemingly perfect act. Only through patient observation and careful deduction had Hard been able to reconstruct her invisible movements and intentions. He thought about the subtle details that had guided him, the 12-minute CCTV blackout, the frozen hands of Campbell's watch, the faint scuff marks along the rug, the puddle by the balcony. Each anomaly had whispered its story, waiting for someone willing to see beyond the obvious. And in the end, it had been the smallest, simplest trace, the brass key, almost lost beneath the tray, that had served as the final confirmation, a symbol of the invisible hand behind the crime. Hard sat in the armchair, turning the key over in his fingers. It was more than a memento, it was a testament to his craft, reminder of the quiet victories won through attention, patience, and insight. Each case left its marks on him, though few understood the weight of such victories. Justice was rarely loud or celebrated, it was measured in details noticed, in truths unveiled, in subtle revelations that only a careful mind could discern. The city continued its rhythm outside, oblivious to the intricacies of human behavior and the silent orchestration that had unfolded in the penthouse above. Hard allowed himself a small smile, thinking of the satisfaction that came from seeing the invisible become visible, the overlooked become revealed. The case of Harold Campbell was closed, yet its lessons lingered, attention to detail, patience, and the humility to recognize that the quietest figure often carries the greatest impact. Benjamin Hard rose, straightened his coat, and moved toward the door. He paused, glancing once more at the penthouse. The scene was untouched now, orderly, almost serene. Each element, each subtle trace, had told its story and had been understood. With the brass key tucked safely away, he stepped out, ready for the next call, the next puzzle, the next invisible story waiting to be uncovered in the labyrinth of human behavior. As he descended the elevator and emerged onto the streets of New York, the city stretched before him, sprawling, chaotic, yet rich with detail. For Hard, every face, every gesture, every overlooked corner was a potential revelation. The key in his pocket was a reminder, a quiet trophy of insight and observation. And Benjamin Hard, as always, would notice what others did not, unraveling truths hidden in plain sight, ready to uncover the invisible threads that tied human actions to their often hidden consequences. The storm was gone, but its echoes lingered in the lessons of the night. The invisible had been revealed, justice quietly served, and the brass key rested safely, a simple artifact of a complex truth, a symbol of patience, perception, and the quiet artistry of detection.